Arnav, why are you speaking in that fake accent? That was one of the first comments I received after uploading my first YouTube video at 13. I grew up making skits, the kind where you play 3 characters, switch voices within seconds, and exaggerate every single reaction. I wrote my first one, I shot it, edited it on my mom's iPad, cross-legged on the bedroom floor, convinced I'd made something good. And within a day, the comments weren't about the story I told. They were about the way I sounded telling it, my made-up, YouTube-influenced accent, the way I rolled or didn't roll my R's. And for years, I kept thinking that was a personal failure, something that was mine to fix, something that was mine to be embarrassed about. It took me a long time and a lot of reading to understand what happened to me has a name. So ladies and gentlemen, this is the permission slip. An invisible set of conditions we learn to believe before we believe we're allowed to belong. And my first condition was simple: sound acceptable. And so I signed the permission slip. I softened my accent, I spoke less. But before that, accents. Sociolinguists will tell you there is no accent that is inherently more correct or more logical or more pleasant than another. Every accent is rule-governed. A Bhojpuri-inflected English and a convent school English are both equally capable of expressing anything the speaker needs to say. So linguistically, there is no hierarchy. But if no language, or might I say accent, is superior, then who decides what sounds acceptable? I first encountered this idea while studying George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion in English class last year. It follows the story of Eliza Doolittle, who's a poor flower girl who speaks with a Cockney accent. Her intelligence never really changes, but once this man, Professor Higgins, changes her accent, suddenly society starts treating her as educated and respectable. This idea that someone's voice can act as a shortcut for assumptions about their class, education, background. Linguists call it indexicality. But at that age, I did not understand linguistic indexicality. All I understood was the pressure to become more acceptable. And so I did. Little did I know that the permission slip would soon lead me to start editing my voice. That it did, but also my gesture, the way I walk, my posture, and the space I allow myself to occupy. At that time, I was actively involved in theater outside school. I grew up with it. I still talk with my hands, tilt my head when listening to someone speak, and treat subtlety as a personal enemy when it comes to facial expressions. In middle school, during trials for an elocution competition, most boys in my grade read Wordsworth's Daffodils plainly and very safely. It was almost as though the words completed their administrative duties, and then they left. Then it was my turn. I modulated my voice, used my face, allowed my hands to become involved. And that earned a few smirks. Something froze, and every moving part of my body, I could feel it. They weren't really questioning whether I could perform the poem correctly. They were more worried about whether I could perform Boyhood correctly. But this time, I did not immediately decide that I needed to become smaller. I already knew what happened when I edited my accent for approval. Instead, I became curious about the contradiction. The same gesture that could be applauded on a stage, how could it be mocked in a classroom? Luckily, philosopher Erving Goffman might have an answer in his theory of sigma. He states that gesture well, stigma does not naturally live inside a gesture. It really emerges when that gesture disrupts the virtual social identity of the person making it to perform. In more simple words, a wrist movement is not inherently feminine, or stillness is not inherently masculine. Their meanings are assigned by an audience. Judith Butler actually takes this further in her theory of gender performativity. Gender appears natural because it's just a set of mannerisms and really words or ways of living that are repeated so consistently across centuries of media and culture that we stop recognizing them as performances. Really, what we might think is normal is just a performance repeated so often that we forget that it was ever learned. Earlier, with my accent, I decided that I had to shrink myself. But this time, with my gestures, the permission slip was more conditional. I could be myself, but only if a stage, story, character, or a narrative authorized it. Once I realized that, the smirks became less convincing. And then, normality made its most persuasive argument yet, when the permission slip followed me into the classroom. It said that certain minds can belong, while others need permission to. 20 out of 110. A little embarrassing to say, but that was my first math score in 11th grade. My teacher at the time called me, and he looked at the paper and then at my face, and he goes, in the nicest way, Arnav, you might want to consider switching to an easier course. He meant well. But Arnav here wanted to be an engineer, still wants to be an engineer. And what he heard was that maybe your mind isn't built for this. And I, surprisingly, or not, had heard that line before. It just kept switching costumes. With my voice, it was, you don't sound like you belong. With my hands, you don't move like you belong. And finally, with my literal brain, it was like, you don't think like you belong. And ironically, at this stage, I could stand in an auditorium, full auditorium, and just tell the entire room that your accent or the way you sound has nothing to do with belonging, or one gesture is really not a diagnosis on your masculinity or femininity, for that matter. So how could I let a test score talk me into doubting my own head? I'd broken 2 mirrors, and I was checking my reflection in the third one. Now, so there's no part of the story here where I tell you that I was a mathematical genius all along. Math stayed hard, really hard. And I worked hard at it more than anything else. But instead of the magical revelation, which is not happening in this TED Talk, I'd like to tell you something more interesting. What I realized was that a difficult experience does not define you. And that a test score can measure one performance, but it does not define the boundaries of your thinking. And so, what happens next? Well, each time I came across the permission slip, I started noticing it faster. First, it took me years. The second time, perhaps months. And the third time, I caught it mid-sentence, when my teacher was still speaking and the red ink was still fresh on the page. Do you see what's happening here? The permission slip only works in the dark. It needs you to be confused about whether the grade or your voice or the situation is really you. And that's the thing. Once you start naming it, you get stronger and it gets weaker. And so once you name it, it's going to become what it always was, paperwork. It's not going to be a verdict. It's going to be paperwork, and paperwork does not get a vote. So here's what I'd like to ask you when you get home. You can do it this week. Whenever you clock someone for their accent, the way they sound, their ambitions, the subject that they take up instead of the one you expected them to take up, the way they move, their manner, their lifestyle, just pause for a second. Think. Don't blame yourself for it. Centuries of conditioning has built that into you. Acknowledge it, and then actually read. Read the work. Listen to the person. Acknowledge them. Appreciate them. See the person for them, and don't see the label. You all must be curious what I ended up doing with the permission slip. Well, I'd like to say that at 13, I made the video private because I thought I needed permission to be heard. And at 17, I'm standing right here with the same hands, the same voice, the same ambition, because I realized, and I've finally understood, that normal was never really a standard to be met. It was a definition I had to rewrite. And so I did. When I tell you that there might be someone out there, a young person, who might be shrinking themselves because someone made them think that they don't belong for however they are or where they come from. And so, as I was telling you, what did I do with the permission slip? I'm not folding it up to keep as a scar and show it to people, nor am I hiding it. I'm just done negotiating with it. And so, whenever I come across it, I recognize its handwriting, I laugh it off, and I walk off. You only need to catch the permission slip once, deliberately. And after that, it gets weaker and you get stronger. And until one day, it's knocking on your door, and you're out, gone, unbothered, exactly as loud as you were always supposed to be. Thank you.